You meet someone and within 3 weeks you're convinced they're the one. You're texting them constantly, thinking about them every spare moment, already imagining what your life together will look like in 5 years. Your friends tell you to slow down, but you can't because this feels different. This feels real. This feels like the connection you've been searching for your entire life. Then 6 months later, maybe a year if you're lucky, you wake up and the intensity is gone. The person who seemed like your soulmate now feels like a stranger you're obligated to spend time with, and you're wondering how you got it so wrong again. You're confused because the feelings were so strong, so overwhelming, so absolutely certain. And here's what nobody tells you about this pattern. It's not about poor judgment or commitment issues or fear of intimacy like every relationship article suggests. It's about how your neurodivergent brain processes reward, novelty, and emotional intensity in ways that make you experience attraction completely differently than the neurotypical people writing all that advice you've been reading. Let's start with what's actually happening in your brain when you meet someone new. Your ADHD brain is constantly seeking dopamine because you don't produce or process it the same way neurotypical brains do. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's about motivation, focus, and the ability to assign value to experiences. When you meet someone who captivates you, their presence becomes one of the most potent dopamine sources available to you. Every text message, every conversation, every moment of their attention triggers a neurochemical response that your brain desperately craves. This isn't metaphorical. The dopamine surge you get from new romantic interest is comparable to what your brain might get from your most engaging special interest, or the hyper-focus state you enter when something finally captures your attention completely. Your brain has found a renewable source of the neurochemical it's been starving for, and it responds by making this person the center of your entire world. The intensity you feel isn't exaggerated emotion or you being overdramatic. It's your brain finally getting sustained access to the neurochemical regulation it needs. And that relief, that sense of everything clicking into place, feels like love because in many ways it's the first time in a long time that your brain has felt balanced. You're not falling too hard too fast by neurotypical standards. You're experiencing appropriate attachment for your neurotype, but you're living in a world designed around different neurological processing. When neurotypical people talk about taking things slow and not getting too invested too quickly, they're working with a completely different neurochemical baseline. Their brains aren't in a constant state of dopamine seeking. They can form attachments gradually because they're not desperate for the neurological regulation that connection provides. You don't have that luxury. When your brain finds something that works, it latches on with everything it has because scarcity is the default state you live in. Think about how this plays out in those first few weeks or months. You're probably texting this person constantly, right? Not because you're clingy or insecure, but because every notification from them gives you that dopamine hit your brain craves. You're staying up until 3 in the morning talking to them even though you have work the next day. You're canceling plans with friends, rearranging your schedule, doing whatever it takes to spend more time with them. Your friends say you're love bombing, that you're coming on too strong. But from your perspective, you're just matching the intensity of what you feel. You're finally focused on something, finally motivated, finally feeling like your brain is working the way it's supposed to. The hyperfocus that usually frustrates you in other areas of your life is now directed at another person, and it feels incredible. They become your special interest, and if you know anything about how your brain works with special interests, you know that means complete absorption. You want to learn everything about them, understand how they think, figure out what makes them happy. You're collecting information about their preferences, their history, their dreams the same way you'd research any topic that captures your attention. Here's where it gets complicated. The other person, especially if they're neurotypical, is experiencing something completely different. From their perspective, you're this incredibly attentive, passionate, focused person who makes them feel like the most important human being on the planet. And they are, to you, in that moment. The attention you're giving them isn't fake or manipulative. It's the genuine expression of where your brain is directing all its resources. But they're interpreting your behavior through a neurotypical lens, where this level of intensity implies certain things about long-term compatibility and emotional stability. They think you found something in them specifically that's creating this reaction, when the reality is more complex. Yes, there are things about them that attracted you, but the intensity of your response is partially about your brain's dopamine regulation system finally having something to work with. They don't know that you felt this way before, maybe multiple times, because each time it happened you were equally certain it was unique and real and permanent. The problem emerges when the novelty starts to fade. This is the part that confuses you the most, because it's not a conscious decision, and it doesn't match how you think feelings should work. You don't wake up one day and decide to care less. What happens is, your brain's dopamine response to this person starts to normalize. They're no longer new, no longer unpredictable, no longer providing the same neurochemical surge they did in the beginning. The text messages that used to light up your brain now feel like obligations. The conversations that used to fascinate you now feel repetitive. The quirks you found endearing now irritate you, and this isn't because anything changed about them as a person. They're the same human being they were 3 months ago when you were convinced you'd found your soulmate. What changed is your brain's neurochemical response to their presence. The dopamine well has run dry, and suddenly spending time with them feels like work instead of relief. You start to notice things about them that bother you. Small things at first. The way they chew, the topics they always bring up, the predictability of their routines. Your brain, no longer getting its dopamine fix from their presence, starts highlighting all the reasons this isn't working instead of all the reasons it is. This is the cruel irony of ADHD attraction patterns. The same brain that made you fall incredibly hard, incredibly fast, is now working just as hard to push you away because it's not getting what it needs anymore. You feel guilty because you remember how intensely you felt before, and you can't understand why those feelings have disappeared. You wonder if you're broken, if you're incapable of real love, if you're doomed to repeat this pattern forever. You might stay in the relationship out of obligation, trying to force yourself to feel what you felt before, or you might end it and spend months wondering if you gave up on something real. If this resonates with you, if you're sitting here recognizing your own pattern, hit that like button because you need to understand you're not alone in this experience, and this isn't a character flaw. This is neurology. The timeline of ADHD attraction follows a predictable pattern that nobody talks about openly. The first phase, that initial meeting and the first few dates or weeks, is characterized by complete absorption. This is when you're at your most attentive, most engaged, most present. You remember everything they tell you because your brain is actually holding on to information for once. You're showing up on time because you're motivated to be there. You're texting back immediately because their messages are more interesting than anything else competing for your attention. This phase typically lasts anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, depending on how much novelty the relationship maintains. During this time, you're probably the best partner this person has ever had. You're thoughtful, passionate, completely focused on them and the relationship. You're making plans, having deep conversations, creating inside jokes and shared experiences. Your executive function problems seem to disappear because you're motivated in a way that overrides your usual difficulties with task initiation and follow through. The second phase starts subtly. You begin to notice that thinking about them doesn't give you the same rush it used to. You still care about them, still want the relationship to work, but the obsessive quality of your thoughts starts to fade. You're not checking your phone every 30 seconds hoping for their message. You're able to focus on other things without them constantly intruding into your thoughts. From a neurotypical perspective, this is healthy. This is what's supposed to happen as a relationship matures from infatuation into something more stable. But for your ADHD brain, this is where the problems begin because your brain doesn't do stable very well. Stable means predictable, and predictable means boring, and boring means no dopamine. You start forgetting to text them back. Not because you don't care, but because their messages no longer trigger the same urgent response in your brain. You start missing plans or showing up late because the motivation that was overriding your time blindness has weakened. The executive function problems that seem to disappear are coming back because you no longer have that intense dopamine-driven focus. The third phase is where things get really difficult. This is when you start actively avoiding the relationship. Their texts feel like pressure instead of pleasure. Making plans feels like adding another obligation to an already overwhelming schedule. You start picking fights over small things, because conflict at least provides some stimulation that your brain can engage with. You might start looking for exit strategies, convincing yourself that you're incompatible or that you settled, or that there's someone better out there. Or you might stay but emotionally check out, going through the motions while your brain is elsewhere. This is the phase where your partner, if they're neurotypical, becomes completely confused because they're wondering what happened to the person they started dating. They're trying to figure out what they did wrong, why you've changed so dramatically, why you seem to have lost interest in them. And the worst part is you can't really explain it to them in a way that makes sense because you don't fully understand it yourself. Now let's talk about what this pattern does to your sense of self over time. Every time you go through this cycle, you collect more evidence that you're unreliable, that your feelings can't be trusted, that you're incapable of maintaining long-term relationships. You start to believe the narrative that you're commitment phobic, or emotionally unavailable, or afraid of intimacy. You read articles about attachment styles and convince yourself you're avoidant, when the reality is much more neurological than psychological. Yes, repeated relationship failures can create genuine attachment issues, but the root cause isn't fear of closeness. It's a dopamine regulation problem that makes the normal progression of relationships feel like suffocation. You probably have a history of relationships that started intensely and ended abruptly. 3-month relationships, 6-month relationships, maybe you've made it to a year or two, but even then you remember feeling trapped and restless for most of that time. Your friends and family have probably noticed the pattern too. They've stopped getting excited when you tell them you've met someone because they know how this story ends. They've heard you say this is different so many times that the words have lost meaning. They've watched you go from introducing someone as the love of your life to barely mentioning them in the span of a few months. Some of them think you're picky, that your standards are too high, that you're always looking for something better. Others think you're scared of commitment, that you run when things get real, that you're stuck in a state of perpetual adolescence. None of them understand that what you're experiencing is a neurological problem, not a maturity problem. They don't know that you want lasting connection just as much as anyone else, maybe more, because you're exhausted from this pattern and terrified that you'll never find something that sticks. The cultural narrative around love and relationships makes this so much worse because we're told that real love is a choice, that feelings are just the starting point, but commitment is what matters. We're told that the initial passion always fades, and that's when real love begins, when you choose to stay and build something together, even when the excitement is gone. And look, there's truth in that for neurotypical people operating with neurotypical brain chemistry. But when you have ADHD, the gap between the intense beginning and the stable middle isn't just about choosing commitment over passion. It's about your brain losing access to the neurochemical regulation that made the relationship feel good in the first place. Choosing to stay when your brain is actively punishing you for the relationship's predictability isn't noble perseverance. It's white-knuckling your way through something that feels fundamentally wrong, and eventually that becomes unsustainable. Let's get specific about what this looks like in practice, because the general pattern is one thing, but the day-to-day experience is where you really feel the impact. In the beginning, you're planning elaborate dates, remembering important details, staying up late to talk about everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about existence. You're engaged, present, emotionally available in ways that surprise even you. Your partner is probably thinking they've met someone incredibly emotionally intelligent and relationship-focused. They're telling their friends about how you remembered that story they told about their 7th birthday, or how you surprise them with their favorite obscure snack from the one conversation where they mentioned it. You're not trying to be impressive. Your brain is genuinely holding on to this information because it's novel and interesting and connected to a strong dopamine source. Fast forward 4 months. Now you're forgetting plans you made just 3 days ago. You're struggling to engage in conversations about their day because your brain keeps wandering to other things. When they're talking about a problem at work, you're nodding along but actually thinking about 17 other things that seem more urgent or interesting in that moment. You're not being deliberately dismissive. Your brain just isn't giving you the neurochemical support to maintain focus the way it did before. They notice the change, but they might not say anything at first because they're trying to be understanding, trying not to be demanding. But inside, they're wondering what changed, what they did to make you less interested, why you don't seem to care anymore. You probably start avoiding certain types of interactions. Deep emotional conversations that require sustained attention become draining instead of connecting. Activities you used to do together now feel like obligations you have to psych yourself up for. Even physical intimacy can be affected because that requires presence and engagement, and your brain is checked out, looking for stimulation elsewhere. You might find yourself thinking about other people, not necessarily because you want to cheat, but because novelty is inherently more interesting than familiarity. New people represent new potential dopamine sources, and your brain is constantly scanning for them because that's what ADHD brains do. They seek novelty because novelty provides the stimulation that stable situations can't offer. Here's what makes this particularly painful. You're probably aware of what's happening as it happens. You can see yourself pulling away. You notice that you're not texting back, that you're making excuses to avoid hanging out, that you're being more critical and less generous in your interpretation of their behavior. And you hate it. You hate watching yourself repeat this pattern again. You hate that you can't force yourself to feel what you felt before. You hate that your brain is essentially sabotaging something that looked promising. But awareness doesn't give you control. You can't think your way into producing more dopamine. You can't logic yourself into finding predictability rewarding. Your brain wants what it wants, and what it wants is novelty and stimulation and intensity, none of which are sustainable in long-term relationships, at least not the way they're typically structured. Some of you have probably tried to solve this problem by only pursuing people who are unpredictable or emotionally unavailable. If you keep chasing someone who's inconsistent with their attention, your brain never fully adapts because there's always uncertainty about whether they'll respond, whether they're interested, whether this is going somewhere. The intermittent reinforcement keeps the dopamine flowing longer than it would in a stable relationship. But this creates its own set of problems because you're essentially choosing relationships that are dysfunctional by design just to manage your neurological needs. You end up with people who can't or won't give you actual partnership. And while your brain might be more engaged, your life becomes chaotic and painful in different ways. You're trading one problem for another, and neither solution actually works. Subscribe if you want to understand the deeper patterns affecting your relationships, because we're going to keep exploring this territory in ways most psychology content completely misses. There's another layer to this that nobody talks about, and it's about how ADHD affects your ability to remember and value the relationship once that initial dopamine surge fades. When you're in that intense beginning phase, every moment with this person feels significant. Your brain is encoding these memories with strong emotional tags because dopamine isn't just about pleasure in the moment. It's also involved in how memories are formed and stored. Those early dates, those late-night conversations, those first kisses, all of that gets stored as highly salient memories because your brain was flooded with dopamine during those experiences. But here's the problem. Once the dopamine response normalizes, your brain stops encoding new experiences with the same emotional significance. You might spend an entire day with your partner, and by the next morning, you barely remember the specifics of what you did together. Not because it wasn't pleasant, but because your brain didn't tag it as important enough to store in an easily accessible way. This creates a warped sense of the relationship's value, because when you're trying to evaluate whether to stay or go, You're comparing the emotionally charged memories from the beginning against the relatively flat current experience. Of course, the beginning seems better. Of course, you wonder if you made a mistake by staying. Your brain is literally unable to recall the recent positive experiences with the same emotional intensity as the early ones, even if the recent experiences were objectively just as good or better. This isn't about the relationship deteriorating. It's about your memory encoding changing based on your neurochemical state. But you don't know this is happening, so you trust your memories and your feelings, and both are telling you that things used to be better, that you used to feel more, that maybe this isn't the right relationship after all. The impact on your partner needs to be addressed too, because they're experiencing something completely bewildering. They met someone who was incredibly attentive and present and emotionally engaged, someone who made them feel seen and valued and important. Then over the course of a few months, that person seemingly disappears and is replaced by someone distant and distracted and seemingly disinterested. From their perspective, they didn't change. The relationship didn't change. So they conclude that either you were faking it in the beginning, or something about them drove you away, or you have serious commitment issues. None of these explanations are quite right, but they're working with the information they have. They don't know about dopamine dysregulation. They don't understand that your brain's reward system functions differently. All they know is that the person they're with now doesn't match the person they fell for. This often leads to a painful dynamic where they're trying harder and harder to recapture your attention while you're pulling further and further away. They might become more accommodating, more affectionate, more available, thinking that if they just do enough, you'll become the person you were in the beginning. But increased effort from them doesn't solve a neurochemical problem in your brain. If anything, it can make things worse because now you have the additional guilt of watching someone try so hard for you, while you can't force yourself to reciprocate with the same energy. You see them making effort and you know you should appreciate it more, should respond with equal investment, but your brain isn't giving you the motivation to do that. So you end up feeling like a terrible person on top of everything else, which just adds shame to the already complicated mix of emotions you're dealing with. Let's talk about the specific ways ADHD brain chemistry makes you vulnerable to this pattern. First, there's the dopamine baseline issue. Your brain doesn't produce or process dopamine the same way a neurotypical brain does. This means you're constantly seeking sources of stimulation and reward just to feel baseline normal. When you find something that provides reliable dopamine, whether that's a video game or a special interest or a new relationship, your brain overinvests in it because it's finally getting what it needs. But dopamine systems are designed to habituate. The same stimulus that caused a strong response initially will cause a weaker response over time. This is true for everyone, but when you're starting from a deficit, the decline feels much more dramatic. Going from finally feeling normal back to the chronic understimulation you're used to feels devastating, even though objectively you're just returning to your baseline. Second, there's the novelty-seeking aspect of ADHD. Your brain is wired to pay attention to new things because new things might be important, might be rewarding, might be the thing that finally provides sustained interest. This served an evolutionary purpose, but in the modern world, especially in relationships, it becomes a liability. Your brain is always scanning for novelty, always wondering if there's something better or more interesting elsewhere. This isn't conscious or intentional. It's automatic background processing that your frontal lobe has limited ability to override. So even when you're with someone you care about, someone who's objectively a good match, part of your brain is still looking around, still wondering, still seeking that next hit of novelty. Third, there's the executive function component. Maintaining a long-term relationship requires consistent effort in areas where ADHD makes things difficult. You need to remember important dates, follow through on commitments, manage your emotional reactions, communicate effectively about problems, balance relationship time with other responsibilities. When you're in that initial hyper-focus phase, motivation overrides your executive function deficits. You suddenly can remember things, can plan ahead, can regulate your emotions better because your brain is getting enough dopamine to support those functions. But when the novelty fades and the dopamine drops, all those executive function challenges come roaring back. Now you're trying to maintain a relationship with the same brain that struggles to remember to pay bills on time and has 3 half-finished projects scattered around your apartment. The relationship becomes another thing you're failing at, another source of shame and inadequacy. Fourth, there's the emotional regulation aspect. ADHD affects how you process and regulate emotions, often leading to more intense emotional experiences and quicker mood shifts. In the beginning of a relationship, this intensity makes everything feel more significant, more meaningful, more real. But as things stabilize, your emotional volatility becomes a problem rather than a feature. Small conflicts feel massive. Minor annoyances feel intolerable. Your partner's perfectly reasonable request for you to help with dishes becomes an overwhelming demand. You might snap at them over nothing, then feel terrible about it, then struggle to explain that it wasn't really about the dishes, it was about your brain being overwhelmed and dysregulated. They're trying to navigate a relationship with someone whose emotional responses don't always match the situation, and that's exhausting for both of you. Here's the part that really matters, the part that determines whether you're going to repeat this pattern forever or actually break the cycle. You need to understand that this is a management problem, not a character problem. Your brain works differently. That's not good or bad, it just is. The way neurotypical people experience relationship development doesn't match your neurological reality, and trying to force yourself into that pattern will keep failing. You need strategies that work with your brain, not against it. This means being honest with yourself about what you're experiencing, getting real about the role dopamine plays in your attractions, and making conscious decisions about relationships instead of just riding the neurochemical wave wherever it takes you. One approach is radical honesty from the start, not on the first date, but once things start getting serious, having a conversation about how your brain works. Explaining that you experience the beginning of relationships more intensely than they might, and that the intensity will fade, and that the fading doesn't mean you care less. It means your brain is adapting to their presence. This is terrifying because you're essentially telling someone that the version of you they're experiencing right now isn't sustainable. But it's also fair. It gives them information they need to make decisions about the relationship. And if you find someone who's willing to understand and work with your neurology, rather than against it, you've found something rare and valuable. Another approach is actively maintaining novelty in the relationship. This doesn't mean manufactured spontaneity or forcing yourself to plan elaborate surprises. It means structuring the relationship in ways that prevent it from becoming completely predictable. Maybe you don't live together, or if you do, you maintain separate spaces and interests. Maybe you build in regular time apart so that coming back together has some of that reunion energy. Maybe you deliberately pursue new experiences together, not constantly but regularly enough that your brain doesn't completely habituate. Some people find that relationships work better for them when they're not following the traditional escalator of increasing enmeshment. Less time together, maintained separately, deliberate space built into the structure. This goes against everything you've been told about how relationships should progress. But if the traditional model doesn't work for your brain, why keep forcing it? Medication is part of this conversation too, though it's not a magic solution. If you're on appropriate ADHD medication, it can help regulate your baseline dopamine levels, which might reduce the dramatic swings between obsessive interest and complete disconnection. But medication doesn't fundamentally change how your brain responds to novelty, and it doesn't eliminate the habituation problem. What it might do is make the transition less dramatic, give you more ability to consciously direct your attention and effort, even when your brain isn't automatically motivated. Some people find that proper medication allows them to maintain relationships that would have crashed and burned otherwise. Others find it helps but doesn't solve the core pattern. Your mileage will vary, and medication should be part of a broader strategy, not the entire solution. You also need to develop better self-awareness about your patterns. Start tracking your relationships, not in a weird obsessive way, but paying attention to the timeline. How long does the intense phase last for you? When do you start noticing the pull back? What are the early warning signs that you're beginning to disengage? When you can see the pattern as it's happening, you have more opportunity to make conscious choices instead of just reacting to your neurochemical state. You can tell yourself, okay, I'm in the part where my brain is losing interest, but I know this person is actually a good match, so I'm going to consciously invest effort even though it's not feeling automatic anymore. This is hard. It requires overriding your brain's immediate feedback, which is essentially what ADHD makes difficult. But it's possible, especially if you have other supports in place like medication, therapy, or a partner who understands what's happening. Drop a comment if you've lived this cycle and thought you were the only one struggling with this pattern, because understanding you're not alone changes how you think about your relationship history. Here's what nobody tells you about the intersection of ADHD and relationship patterns. The problem isn't that you fall in love too fast or too hard. The problem is that we've built an entire cultural narrative around relationships that assumes everyone's brain chemistry works the same way. We talk about love as if it's this pure emotional experience untethered from neurology, as if the feelings you have exist independently of dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. But they don't. Every emotion you experience is neurochemical. Every attraction, every bond, every feeling of connection is your brain processing information and responding with specific chemical outputs. When your brain's chemical systems work differently from the baseline that all this advice assumes, of course the standard relationship progression isn't going to fit your experience. The advice to take things slow is designed for brains that can actually modulate their investment incrementally. Your brain doesn't work that way. It's either all in or struggling to engage at all. The advice to let love develop gradually assumes that mild interest can grow into strong attachment over time. But your brain needs strong stimulation to maintain attention to anything, including relationships. The advice about how the honeymoon phase ends and real love begins assumes that the shift from intensity to stability feels like a natural evolution rather than a devastating loss of something essential. All of this advice was written by and for people with different neurological operating systems than yours, and then you're left wondering why following it keeps leading to failure. Think about how this affects your entire approach to dating and relationships. You probably cycle through periods of intense relationship seeking, followed by periods where you avoid dating altogether. When you're single, part of you is desperately seeking that connection, that intense bond, that feeling of your brain finally working right. You're swiping through apps, going on dates, putting yourself out there because you remember how good it feels when you find someone who lights up your brain. But another part of you is exhausted from the pattern, cynical about your ability to make anything last, reluctant to start something that you already know how it ends. So you oscillate between hope and resignation, between putting in maximum effort to find someone and completely withdrawing from the dating scene. When you do meet someone promising, you probably go all in immediately, because that's how your brain works. You're texting constantly, seeing them multiple times a week, integrating them into your life quickly. And this works great until it doesn't. Your friends who've watched this before try to warn you to slow down, but you can't really explain to them why slowing down isn't an option your brain is offering you. Either you engage fully, or you don't engage at all. There's no middle ground where you casually date someone for 6 months while gradually getting to know them. Your brain doesn't do casual when it finds something rewarding. It does obsessive focus, or it does nothing. The aftermath of each relationship adds another layer of complication to the next one. You carry forward the shame of how the last one ended, the confusion about why your feelings changed, the fear that you'll do it again. You might overcompensate by trying to force yourself to stay interested longer than your brain actually is. You might undercompensate by ending things at the first sign of the dopamine drop, not even giving the relationship a chance to develop beyond the honeymoon phase. You might become hypervigilant about your feelings, constantly monitoring whether you still feel enough, whether this is real, whether you're about to repeat the pattern. This hypervigilance creates its own problems, because now you're anxious about the relationship on top of everything else. And anxiety definitely doesn't help with emotional regulation or executive function. Let's address the specific challenge of long-term relationships for ADHD brains. Is it possible? Yes. Is it easy? No. Is it going to look like what you see in movies or what your neurotypical friends describe? Probably not. Long-term relationships with ADHD require accepting that motivation and interest will fluctuate. There will be periods where you feel deeply connected and engaged, and there will be periods where you're going through the motions and relying on commitment rather than feeling. This is true for everyone to some extent, but for you, the swings are likely to be more dramatic. The key is finding someone who understands this and doesn't interpret your periods of disconnection as personal rejection or relationship failure. You need a partner who can maintain their own sense of security, even when you're in a withdrawn phase. Someone who doesn't need constant reassurance that you still care, because honestly, you're not always going to be able to provide that reassurance in the moment. Someone who has their own interests and friendships and sources of fulfillment, so they're not dependent on you for all their emotional needs. Someone who's okay with a relationship that might involve more space and independence than the cultural ideal suggests is healthy. This isn't about finding someone who accepts being treated poorly. It's about finding someone who understands that different neurotypes need different relationship structures, and that what looks like distance or disinterest from the outside is actually you managing your brain's needs. Communication becomes absolutely critical, and this is an area where many people with ADHD struggle. You need to be able to talk about what's happening in your head, even when it's complicated and contradictory. You need to be able to say things like, "I'm in a phase where I'm struggling to feel connected, but I know this is about my brain chemistry, not about you or the relationship." You need to be able to hear your partner's needs and concerns, even when your brain is telling you to avoid the conversation. You need to develop skills in sitting with difficult emotions and not just acting on your immediate impulses to run or withdraw or end things. None of this is easy, and all of it requires conscious effort in exactly the areas where ADHD makes things difficult. The timeline issue matters more than most people realize. When you're on a different neurochemical timeline than your partner, you're essentially experiencing the relationship at different speeds. You've already moved through the honeymoon phase and into the habituation phase while they're still in the falling in love stage. They're getting more attached as you're getting less engaged. This creates a mismatch that's nobody's fault, but affects everything. They want more time together as you're needing more space. They're ready to take the next step as you're questioning whether this is right. And the difficult truth is that sometimes this mismatch is insurmountable. Sometimes the relationship ends not because anyone did anything wrong, but because your brains were operating on incompatible timelines. But here's what you need to understand about all of this. The pattern you've been living isn't inevitable. It's not a life sentence. It's what happens when you try to force your ADHD brain into neurotypical relationship structures without understanding what's happening or having strategies to manage it. Once you understand the role dopamine plays in your attractions, once you recognize the pattern as it's happening, once you develop strategies that work with your neurology instead of against it, you have options. You can make different choices. You can structure relationships differently. You can communicate honestly about your needs. You can find partners who are compatible with how your brain actually works rather than how you wish it worked. This might mean your relationships look different from the standard template. Maybe you don't follow the relationship escalator. Maybe you maintain more independence than couples are supposed to. Maybe you need more novelty and stimulation built into the structure than traditional partnerships allow. Maybe you do better with partners who are also neurodivergent and understand these challenges from personal experience. Maybe you need relationships that are more flexible, that ebb and flow rather than demanding consistent intensity. Whatever structure actually works for your brain is valid, even if it doesn't match what society says relationships should look like. The goal isn't to fix yourself or train yourself to be more neurotypical in relationships. The goal is to understand how your brain works and make conscious choices that align with your neurology, while still meeting your needs for connection and partnership. This requires letting go of shame about how you functioned in past relationships. It requires accepting that your experience of love and attraction is different, but not less valid than neurotypical experiences. It requires being honest with partners about your limitations, while also recognizing your unique strengths. Because here's the thing, when your brain is engaged, when dopamine is flowing, you're capable of presence and attention and emotional depth that's genuinely special. The hyperfocus that becomes a liability over time is also what makes you an incredibly attentive partner in the beginning. Your ability to dive deep into understanding someone, to remember details, to make them feel seen and valued, these are real gifts. They're just not sustainable at the same intensity indefinitely. You're not broken. You're not incapable of love. You're not doomed to hurt people and be hurt. You're working with different neurological equipment and you need different strategies. The pattern of intense beginnings and painful endings isn't your destiny. It's what happened when you didn't know what you were working with. Now you know. Your brain seeks dopamine, responds intensely to novelty, habituates to repeated stimuli, and struggles with the executive function demands of long-term partnership. None of this means you can't have lasting love. It means you need to approach relationships with strategies designed for your actual neurology, not the neurology the self-help books assume you have. It means being honest about your patterns, finding partners who can work with your needs, structuring relationships in ways that maintain enough novelty to keep your brain engaged, and developing the self-awareness to make conscious choices instead of just riding the neurochemical roller coaster wherever it takes you. This is harder than following the standard relationship script, but it's also more likely to actually work for how your brain operates in the real world.